Hi and welcome back. Now this is a bit of a, it's not a right laugh. Anyway, this one is 4.1, which is identify relevant policies and procedures covering confidentiality, data protection and disclosure. And then we're also going to run on to 4.2, which is identify situations when confidentiality protocols must be breached. Protocols are sort of guidelines, ways of doing things. Okay, so let's start off with confidentiality in schools. So slide 2. So whether you are a volunteer in school or a paid member of staff, you're going to find out all sorts of information about the learners that you work with. Some of the information will be essential because it will affect how you work, and that could be about medical conditions, special educational needs, all that kind of stuff. It'll be things that are essential for you, but it's very important, and the schools will be very good at explaining how essential it is that that personal information needs to remain confidential. And by that, it's sort of on a needs to know basis. So you wouldn't speak to people obviously outside of the school about the children and the situations they are in, but also you wouldn't speak to all the staff about it either. The information that you have, is private and personal information for the most part, and it needs to be held on a real need to know basis. I think people are often, when they start working in schools, are surprised that the staff room's not like a hotbed of gossip about what's going on. It really isn't. It's very important that people have the training and the understanding to really respect the information that they have. It's a lot of information. Some of it you don't really want to know, to be quite honest with you. Okay, slide 3, confidentiality and abuse. So when a child has been abused by an adult, obviously they've been massively let down and disrespected. And why it's so important that if you're the person that they speak to, if you're the person that they disclose that information to, is not dealt with in a really confidential manner. If they were to find out that they've shared this secret that they haven't told anybody about, and they've decided to share it with you, and then you go and tell other people, it's like they've been sort of humiliated and disrespected again. When somebody gives you that information, it's so important that you deal with it in a way that they can continue to have faith in you and believe in you. Because if you're the first adult that they have trusted, you can't let them down. You can't be that person. It's really important. And also, look, moving on to slide 4, you have to think about, there's real damage, that could be in sharing information. So, I mean, the damage could be that you make somebody the centre of gossip. So, if the child has alleged that there's been some abuse, and maybe there has and maybe there hasn't, and I'm sure you've heard of stories where people have been attacked because people think that they have done something, and maybe that doesn't always end up to be the case. There was a thing in the news a couple of years ago. Someone had their house burnt down. Someone thought they were a paedophile, and they weren't at all, but there was gossip, and it got completely out of hand. Also, if you are somebody that has shared this information, then where the place you work, the school or the college, the reputation will suffer, because you have a duty of care to do the right things by the learners in your care. And if it's felt that you can't be trusted with this kind of information, that's massively damaging for the reputation of where you work. So it's all pretty important stuff. Moving on to slide 5, legal requirements in schools. So all settings, schools and colleges, will have a very clear confidentiality policy. It's really important that information is stored really safely, and all settings that do have information on learners will have to register with the Information Commissioner's Office about the sort of information that they have, how they propose to use it, and to ensure that it complies with the rules. So slide 6 actually gives you a bit more information about what they have to tell the ICO, why they're holding the data, what data they have, the source of it, any countries they may transfer data to whom they'll give data. And basically data is any information that relates to an identifiable person. So the sorts of data we would have on children would be their address, their date of birth, medical needs, previous schools, assessment results, if they are receiving free school meals, if there's been a case of where there's been a safeguarding issue, if they are a looked after child, if they are allergic to nuts, lots and lots and lots of information. Some of it, not particularly interesting, some of it massively sensitive. Some children will be living under an assumed identity because they are, they've been moved from a really difficult situation. Some children will have, parents looking for them actively, so they will, have an assumed identity, and there's often a lot going on, and often you haven't got the faintest idea about what the situation is with the kids that you work with until you need to know, and then you need to know. Okay, so slide 7, keeping data safe and information confidential. So as I've said, settings have all sorts of information, and it's really important that it is kept really securely. So if it's information on a computer, everything's got to be password protected. Passwords need to be changed really regularly. If it's on a piece of paper, it needs to be put in locked cabinets. If it's on computers, you need to make sure you've got antivirus software and firewalls, and also that computers can't be left on. And it used to be the case that you'd log onto a computer and you'd disappear off, make a cup of tea, and you'd come back. And these days, all the computers that I work with now, if you haven't touched them for 10 seconds, they sort of shut down. You have to log back in. It keeps things very safe. You have to be really mindful of things like confidential phone calls. So sometimes if you're speaking to a parent or a social worker or police or anything like that, you really need to make sure that you're in a private place where you can't be overheard, and that can be quite difficult if you're working from a shared office or if you're in a staff room. Sometimes you have to actually ask people to go. Confidential documents have to be shredded. It's not enough to put. There used to be a case where we would just put them in a special bag and then they get incinerated. In schools and colleges these days, they have special safety bins where you slot paper into like a post box, and then that gets taken by a professional shredding company. So it's really important that we can prove that things are being dealt with safely. Confidential documents, anything which has got anybody's identifiable information on, cannot be left out on desks. It has to be locked away. Offices have to be locked if they're not in use, if they've got bits of paper like that floating around. Personal data is only kept for a certain period of time, and it depends on the setting, and it depends on the data. I think currently in schools it's got to be, I think it's 25 years from the child's date of birth. So it's a long time. It's a long time. There need to be really thorough, regular checks made onto security systems and to procedures to make sure that it actually works, all of these things you've got in place. And staff have training, quite thorough training about data protection. I did mine last week actually, and it was probably 2 hours. It was an online training session where you have to read through lots of stuff, answer some questions. You have to get 70% to be able to pass it. You do that every 3 years, but there's also an annual short update because things change all the time, and also they have to remind people to be so careful with all the information that's held. Okay, so slide 9, disclosure of information. So the disclosure is sharing information. There's obviously some very strict data protection laws, and as I've said, information can only be shared on a need-to-know basis. The Data Protection Act allows everyone to see all the information. So if you have a parent that wants to see all of the information that a school holds, they can demand that, and you have 2 weeks then to find any email, any letter, any notes, anything which has got their child's name on. So it's really important that when you are making notes, that everything you write is really appropriate. Everything you say on email could be shown to that person and to that person's parents. Keeps you on your toes. Okay, so slide 10, and more disclosure. So schools can share information about things like examination results, and they will talk about those in general terms. They are allowed to also name pupils, but they have to ideally get permission first. So you often see in the newspapers, if people have had like superb GCSEs or A-level results, they will, they'll have a photograph, and they will say, the names of the children who have done it. It's good practice to get permission before you do anything like that. If a student is moving schools or moving abroad, then the schools and the college can't send on information unless they're absolutely sure that the country that it's going to has got equivalent methods of keeping it safe. So if you're going to send information to somewhere in the European Union, they have the same rules of looking after data that we do, so you can be fairly confident that's going to be okay. If it's going somewhere else, you need to make additional checks. Okay, so the last couple of slides, nice and quick. So we've got identify situations when confidentiality protocols can be breached. So your protocol is your rules and your guidelines about how things are done. So when you can actually share information, there are some very specific times when you can do that. So if you think that a child is at risk of harm, then you can share information. If you think that somebody is acting on misinformation, so you think that there's going to be something happening because of information that's not correct, then you need to, then you are allowed to say, actually, no, I don't think that's right. If when a child tells you that if they have been abused, obviously you have to tell them they have to be happy to share the information. Then obviously you speak to the DSL. If you have any concerns about confidentiality, breaching it and all the rest of it, every school and college will have a largely similar policy, largely similar procedure. It's really important to know how it works in your school. There will be quite a lot of training on what to do in these situations, and it's one of the the whole of the safeguarding stuff. It's really important that you're really sort of happy and confident with that information, because when things happen, as I often say, happens really, really quickly. You don't really have a chance to do the flapping. You just sort of need to know. So it's a good one to be really, really thorough with. Okay, there we go. That's lesson 3.